Hey everybody, welcome back to Community Conversations. This is Aaron Putzke. Again, I'm a professor of biology at Whitworth University. This is our fourth conversation. I'm really excited today to have Dr. Ben McFarland with us from Seattle Pacific University. Ben, can you just introduce yourself real quick as far as department and your specialty, and also tell us what makes the coronavirus pandemic situation so interesting and relevant to your life?
Yeah, I am a professor of biochemistry, and I'm in the Department of Chemistry, not biology, but we still get along, right?
We'll
So,
forgive you for that, yeah.
yeah. I teach a lot of biochemistry courses. I also teach a science writing course at Seattle Pacific University. And so we have a lot of similarities between our universities and things like that. And so I also do research, just like Dr. Putzke, and we actually study structural immunology in my lab. And so my students are actually doing antibody binding studies, or they were doing it before we had to send everyone home. We were working on a different disease, but it gives me a standpoint from which to look at this epidemic, not from the virus side of things, but from the immune system side of things. And so I know a lot about testing antibodies and what the response of the immune system is to this virus. There's a lot that we don't know about that right now. But hopefully we have some things to learn that we can find out where our immune systems are doing good things for us and haven't told us what those good things are yet. I think that there's hopefully some good surprises down the road for how our immune systems take care of it. And so that's my perspective. I'm a little biased toward the immune system because I study it and I study how it responds.
Right.
There's a sad side to that as well with this, because it looks like when you have the severe disease and when you have the complications and mortality that come from COVID-19, that's not directly from the virus, but it's from the immune system overreacting. So I've got to say the immune system is really involved with all stages of this epidemic. And so it's from that standpoint, especially I'm focusing on the antibody side of things. There's a lot of sides to the immune system, and I can talk about the other sides of the immune system with a little less expertise, but it's still close enough to my area that I'm finding this to be I see applications of my research every day with this, and it actually gets me excited about the possibility for preparing the next generation of doctors to be able to go into these situations and to be able to prepare students to become the doctors who will respond as we are asking our entire healthcare sector to respond right now. So that's as a researcher and as a teacher that I look at it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. We just actually finished a section on site-specific recombination in my molecular genetics course. And part of that is the VDJ recombination that happens with antibody production and stuff like that. And so the timing of this is sort of perfect in that way, if you will, of talking about the relevance and the application of our immune system and how it not only responds to stuff that we've seen before, but especially in this case, how does it respond to what we haven't seen before?
Yeah.
So you're in Seattle, and so you've been following things very closely, obviously, not just from a proximity perspective, but from a numbers perspective and looking at it from an epidemiological standpoint of how many are getting infected and how is this spreading, and talk about flattening the curve and all that kind of stuff. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you're following this and the sources that you're using, the numbers that you're using to keep track of this?
Yeah, it sounds like you want to see some graphs.
Oh, who wouldn't love graphs?
Yeah, so I've got some graphs for you. So again, my standpoint is as a structural immunologist, I'm definitely a biochemist with 9 letters being chemist and 3 letters being bio, right? And so I look at this as a chemist in a sense, but these are complicated chemical reactions. At one level, you can actually understand them as with the same tools that a chemical kineticist uses for like a chemical reaction in a test tube in the lab. You always got to be careful because there's a lot more complexities going on. And with that in mind, dealing with the complexities in data and what we don't know, what we're uncertain about, has sort of been the tools that I've been pulling on to try to understand the data so I can take the data, look at it as a scientist, say, what do we know, what don't we know, and then say, how are we doing based on that? And so that's the graphs that I've got right here. Let me go ahead and share this with you. All right, so hopefully you can see that right there. This is the this is in the format of some of the YouTube things that I've done, and it turns out that every couple days there's enough new data to be able to talk about what's going on with the virus and to be able to say what's a meaningful change in the data.
Right.
And so basically there's three types of data that we can access publicly at some level, and I can check up every day and I can add onto my Excel worksheet, you know. And it's really important because these three types of data behave differently as far as speed goes and noise goes. And so the three kinds of data that I want to show you, three kinds of graphs for, is going to be first the cases, which is the fastest data that you can get. You're just detecting whether you can see viral RNA in the person. Mm-hmm. That depends heavily on who you test, though. You can only run so many tests, and we were behind the curve. We're catching up now, is the good news with testing. Mm-hmm. But here in the US, we're really behind the curve as far as who we have tested. We test the people that we want to know if they have a positive result or not. And so it's a little bit like scratch-off tickets that you buy for the lottery or whatever. Right. You're testing the ticket as you're scratching it off. And then you know, did I win the lottery or not? Or do I have the viral RNA or not?
Right.
You have to scratch off a lot of tickets to get a good idea of just how many winning tickets are there out there. You know,
right.
So that's the first kind of data. Hospitalizations are the second kind of data, and those to me actually are the most important. But they're also hard to see because hospitals, for patient privacy concerns, don't put that data all online. And you've got to, they report it different ways. Do they report newly hospitalized patients or currently hospitalized residents? Some counties like King County don't even report the data by county. And we just got some good data in the paper this morning about hospitalizations for the state of Washington. And so I'm going to show some data and I'm going to compare them with previous models that have been put out. Mm-hmm. I've been able to track Snohomish County hospitalizations, and for those who don't know, Snohomish is the county just north of King. It is the county where the first US case was identified in a Snohomish County hospital in mid-January. There was a 35-year-old man who had recently traveled from Wuhan, and he actually was hospitalized for this, and he's the first person that we know had it. And then the first case of community transmission was also in Snohomish County, and that was at the end of February when that was announced. We know we've had it in Snohomish for a while now because we know it's been community transmission case. And then the third amount of data, this is the most certain, but it's also the slowest to develop. It's kind of a lagging indicator. That's the data of how many people have died from this, the mortality data. The good news about that data is I've been keeping track of it for King and Snohomish counties, and it is still linear. It has not surged, and I continue to be able to say that up through yesterday's data that I've been able to collect. Mm-hmm. So I want to show you those three graphs, and I want to work my way back up from that. The data I'm going to be comparing it to was actually published in the Seattle Times just on Sunday, I believe, where they have a model that took the deaths per day for Washington State and then projected where is that going. And I like this graph right here because it has a clear line between the data that we've collected, which is over on the left side of the graph. And you see how that's really noisy data. It's going up and down day by day, but it's following a trend line up. Mm-hmm. They're trying to estimate from that data how far is it going to go up, assuming that it follows the usual epidemiological sort of bell curve that we're seeing. It depends a lot on many things, and the data is really noisy. But this was their projection that we had an estimated peak of Washington state deaths at 27 deaths on April 21 was the prediction. There's a lot of uncertainty to that. And of course, the newspaper doesn't show the uncertainty. But their website, if you go to their website, actually shows the uncertainty and talks about how they made these projections. And looking at how they made the projections, I'm actually pretty happy with how they did it. They seem to be making conservative projections. They don't seem to be overly pessimistic or optimistic. And also one of the signs that these are good projections is they reflect the uncertainty properly. If you look at this graph, the uncertainty is reflected by the red shaded area. And you can see that there's a whole lot of uncertainty because honestly, we have a whole lot of uncertainty still. We're the first in the country to sort of be at this stage of the epidemic. And so what I've done is I've taken their data and I've taken the data of deaths per day for Washington State as a whole that's come out since this was published. And I plotted that as blue dots on the data. I deliberately made the blue dots small because I don't want anybody to be reading too much into one blue dot. You see that there was a blue dot, I believe it was 3 days ago, where we had more than 20 deaths in that day.
Right.
And that was way above the red shaded area. But if you look at all the dots, I have about 7 dots since this came out. And you can see that those dots are sort of scattered around on the data, but 6 of the 7 actually fall below the median line that they're projecting. And this is good news for noisy data like this, at least for falling below the line. And so that means that the model probably wasn't too optimistic. In fact, it might have been even slightly pessimistic, which would be a really good thing. To have a pessimistic model is much better than having an optimistic one. You want your models to be pessimistic, right?
Yep.
So this is the data, and again, it's really noisy, but you see that the noisiness in the data is sort of holding true to where it was before.
So Ben, can I just ask you real quick back on that? That seems to be a good thing to think about with respect to headlines in the way that any given day, right? If they say 20 new deaths today, but it's good to zoom out and say, yeah, but that's one data point, and look at all the other data points surrounding it, which don't support a significant trend in it's going to go double every day, 20, 40, up like that.
Yeah. If you take 2 points of this data, you can draw almost any slope of line between 2 points that you sort of cherry pick. Right. The important thing is to put all your data, treat all your data the same, just like you want to treat all your children the same, okay? You want to treat all your data the same, and you want to average out over that data to see where it's going. But it's really tricky because, number one, it takes weeks for this disease to develop. Number two, this disease is very contagious early on. So we need to have pessimistic models, honestly, because we want to be very careful that we don't underestimate the disease. With that in mind, honestly, seeing how the data comes out, we don't have any kind of, we don't have any way to really know what's coming other than to take as much data as we can and treat it fairly. And that's what it does when you look at the data week by week rather than day by day.
Right. Okay. So as far as the modeling goes, what can you say about, are we really able to learn anything kind of accurately from what's happening elsewhere in the world, or are there situations different enough from what we're experiencing here that it's really hard to incorporate that data into any modeling that we do?
Yeah. Well, the virus is essentially the same. It has mutated at the regular rate for coronavirus mutations, but that mutation rate means that you have about a dozen letters different in a 30,000 letter genome, okay? That's very unlikely to have a functional difference at this point. So everybody's, we have the pop culture thing about like the X-Men being mutants, right? And we have this thing about mutations can have these big effects, and they can once in a while, but I don't think we have a good feeling for the fact that most mutations don't have any effect at all. And when you've only had a dozen different mutations, I find it very unlikely that any of those dozen out of 30,000 letters are significantly changing the way that this virus works. So that means that disease progression, the virus should be the same all around the world. Of course, people aren't the same all the way around the world. Reporting standards aren't the same. All the social things above the virus are definitely not the same, and you have to sort of correct for that. One of the things that this model does that I like is they really do correct for age demographic differences. This virus has a big difference in how it affects. It does hit everyone hard. It's important to emphasize that point. But as far as mortality goes, that's very age dependent, and that data has been proven in country after country. This model accounts for that. So in some senses, older countries like Italy are going to naturally be hit harder by this virus than a younger country like South Korea, or the US actually looks like South Korea rather than Italy when you look at just age demographics. Different states even have different age demographics.
Right.
So I'm happy with how this data has been played out. The other thing that they do with this data is they sort of project how deaths are going to go from the multiple countries that have been there before. They took the Washington state data that had been collected to this point, the Italy data, the China data, and I believe the South Korea data. I think that those four are the major things that they sort of trained their model on. And then they're making predictions based on those.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's a pretty solid model. There's some debate over, is this too optimistic? Oh, the other thing about this model assumes that we are all social distancing and that social distancing is having an effect similar to what we saw in Wuhan. And that's an area of debate. That's the one place where this model might be overly optimistic. If we can't social distance as effectively as Wuhan did, it's possible that the numbers for this model will come in on the upper end of the error range. But it looks like that's holding true for the past week, at least for Washington State. But we've also had very good, strong social distancing measures in place for several weeks. But at least we've got that. At least it looks like that's working, and we're coming in below the model for the data that's come in for the past week.
How do you know how do they actually factor that in? Social distancing. When you take that into account, what does that actually mean as a variable?
Yeah. Well, the same institute is the one that gave a report very early on. And from the timing of this report, I believe that Jay Inslee read this report and acted on it, which I think is kind of cool to think about the idea that science is helping us set policy in this case.
Yeah.
And what it did is it talked about social distancing in terms of contact reduction. So you have contacts with other people who are outside your immediate family. And the question is, how many contacts do you have? If you go to work and you're contacting surfaces, you're breathing the same air, that is a contact between other people that can spread disease. And so what they did is they said, if we can reduce contacts by 50%, then we can get a line on this graph where current infections flatten off. Not go down, but flatten off.
Right.
And I think that we've hit that. So that's what this model is built on. It's built on, can we get a 50% contact reduction? And it assumes that that's the first couple of words in the paper. It's really important that they want you to know. This is assuming that we socially distance as effectively as 50%. And again, it looks like Washington has socially distanced that effectively. And that's where all the numbers come from. So the one thing about this model, they do it for all 50 states. But I'm not quite so sure if you have a state that hasn't socially distanced, they would say from the beginning, don't look at our model. Don't expect our model to predict your state until you start socially distancing.
Right, right. And would you say that, you know, maybe like New York is an example of what happens if we don't social distance as aggressively, I guess? It seems like maybe because of Inslee, maybe not, I'm not sure, but you know, Seattle especially set a real tone nationally for this is what it needs to look like. And it seems like others are sort of following, maybe not in different levels of kind of social distancing aggression. Would you say that New York didn't do that enough based on the data that we're seeing, or did it just not work?
They did it later than we did. They had a lot of contacts still going on. And I think another important factor, urban density is going to have a lot of contacts. That means that you probably have to have more contact reduction in order to have, if you have more contacts already, you have to work harder to reduce those contacts to get the same kind of effect. And so I think that New York City, from what I saw, it looked like they were acting pretty much as fast as me looking at the data and seeing this modeling from Seattle. I didn't see anything at the time that suggested to me that New York was moving slowly when it came to social distancing. In hindsight, we can look back, and I think because of their greater urban density, they needed to socially distance earlier. We also had a lot of grassroots social distancing, a lot of work from home initiatives that came out even before Inslee did anything, before the initial model came out in the first place. SPU was canceled. I shouldn't say canceled, it was moved online, you know.
Sorry, careful.
Yeah, meeting together was because we, as you can tell, there's still a lot of work that we've got to do, right?
Yep, right.
But meeting together was canceled. And I think that those kind of things didn't happen as much on as great of a scale in New York City. I wouldn't say that that is even anybody's fault.
Right.
Based on what we knew at the time, we can look back now and say a place like New York needs to be even more aggressive than a place like Seattle when it comes to this, because it looks like in New York we've gotten past the tipping point. They have a model for New York actually on another page, and that model shoots up. It looks like the model is being followed more rigorously, or it's hitting the line, and the line is higher in New York. Yeah, it's just like, it's kind of like in hindsight, I don't want to blame the government for moving slowly, but looking back on it now, I do think if we're worried about future waves, we should consider urban density, and we should consider that New York needs to be on a quicker trigger than other places. But now we're seeing how it plays out in the rural, and I don't really know exactly. We'll have to see and keep a watch. I just want our policy to be defined based on scientific data is better than being defined by somebody driving around and seeing how many people they see holding hands outside and being upset because they're social distancing. I don't think that's very scientific. So I like how Seattle has been an example of how you can have a scientific model, and we're so far following that model as shown on this graph right here.
Right, right. Interesting. Okay, so you've got this data, and then that kind of moves into where you're...
Yeah, so this is the mortality data. This is the hospitalization data, and I've collected this for Snohomish County because they've actually published this. King County has not. And you can see that the hospitalized, and this is also very important to keep track of, is this people in the hospital right now or people newly admitted to the hospital day by day? And so you can see the lines going up, and it's still going up from the way that we have, but it is about, we have about 73 people in the hospital reported right now from Snohomish County. We can do a lot of things, but I want to point out about this data. This data too has gone up and down. You can see where it actually went down. I'm just glad it hasn't gone up the same way it went down. It's going up with a slow and steady slope, but this looks like the kind of increase that will not trigger a critical care crisis. It looks like this is the amount of thing that the hospitals can handle. It's going to tax them because every bed that's taken up by a COVID patient is not going to be taken up by somebody else who needs it. And yet at the same time, Snohomish County appears to have enough beds as long as we don't have a surge coming. And the longer we go, the more convinced I am that there is not a surge coming.
So that's getting at flattening the curve, right? You're talking about that healthcare burden threshold that we're trying to stay under.
Yeah, and in fact, if you look at this data, it looks like, you see how it looks like it was going up exponentially, and then it went up really flat. So it's going up in the curve. I'm not sure, but it sure looks like it was going up, and then it sort of, not out of the woods yet, but I'm hoping that we've already surged in Snohomish. Again, they have the first cases, you know.
Right.
They just had statewide data in the paper this morning, and this is slightly different reporting. And so I did some conversion factors to convert this to currently hospitalized. What they presented was hospitalizations, newly hospitalized people by week. The good news is this last week that ended on March 28th, newly hospitalized patients with COVID symptoms are down. And so you see that it's down from 251 to 193. That's really good. We've got to also remember each of these patients is probably in the hospital for about 2 weeks.
Mm.
So I did sort of what I tried to be some sort of pessimistic modeling for how long would these patients be staying in the hospital. And because I want to plot that onto the other graph that the IHME puts out,
Right.
which is this purple line right here, which is beds taken up by COVID-19 patients. And you can see that I've got 2 blue dots on each of those. The lower blue dot in each case is just taking the data and multiplying it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended up being below the curve, including being below the curve on the mid-March date, which was supposedly the data that the researchers that made this model, it was supposedly data that they had in their system.
Okay.
So I multiplied it out, and I got a number that was falling below the line. And so what I did is I just said, well, okay, it looks like I'm off by a factor of, 30%. So I'm just going to multiply all my data by 30%, assuming that it's a linear thing and things like that. So a lot of assumptions right here. It's why I'm showing you 2 data points rather than 1. But the 2 data points are my best effort to plot out current hospitalizations onto the scale of this curve. And so even trying to bump that data up as much as I possibly could, we're still falling below the line, even below the purple shaded area, although we seem to be tracking the bottom of the purple shaded area. Again, it looks like we're coming in on the low end of the model. And that is really good news because it means we are not surging. The lower we stay now, the lower this peak is going to be, and the more certain we are going to be below the critical care capacity, which is that the total number of beds in the whole Washington hospital system is shown by the purple line way up there.
Right.
We don't want to cross that line, and we want to stay away from that line because, again, that's total capacity, and we're just talking about COVID patients here. All that said, this looks good.
Yeah, that's not even taking into account, if the beds are available, there have to be people to actually take care of the people in the beds. And so that's another thing that's hard to take into account in these situations, but it's something that we need to be absolutely hypersensitive to when we think about our daily behaviors.
Right. So again, it looks like we are coming in about at the bottom range of what the model predicted. And I take that as good news.
Yeah, that's great.
So so that was the hospitalizations graph. The one other graph that I've taken to do it comes from this place right here. It's published by a bunch of physics people. So it's minute physics, but it's actually a good example of applying physics to biology because it's a very simple way to take exponential growth and to plot it on a curve that we can see what that growth is doing. So there's a whole video about how this works. It's really just a log plot of new cases on the y-axis versus total cases on the x-axis. And they plot it over time. The thing that I want to do, they do it as a nice little animation, and they do it by countries. It's really important to remember this is based on cases. This means that you're detecting viral DNA, viral RNA, excuse me.
Right, yeah.
But I made my own version of this graph. The real good thing about this, going up is bad, going down is good.
Right.
And if you can see yourself going down in any way, that means at least you have slower growth. And so here's the thing, the only thing I'm not sure about, I'm not sure if my head is blocking what the colors mean. I plotted it out by states. And as the epidemic goes on, the graph goes up. And the gray states that you can see that have more cases than anyone else, that's New York and New Jersey.
Right.
The good news is for each of those, you see a little divot down. The bad news is those are huge numbers if you look at it on a log scale. You got a ton of cases, but at least in New York and New Jersey, you see some evidence that it's being controlled in some small way by this point because you can see the data moving down when you get to the right side of the graph. The other thing I want to do is I want to look at different states. And so I zoomed in here. I took the New York and New Jersey off of this one because, of course, we're really interested in Washington. I made a screen for the Evergreen state. And so the Washington line is below other lines, still growing. Remember, cases are still growing because we are so far behind in testing. We don't know how much of this is the disease growing versus our testing growing. And you can see that we're below all the other states. We're still increasing, but several. So I don't see it going down enough, even on a day-to-day basis, is Michigan. So that's a state that I'm particularly worried about right now. California also is not going down, and California has had huge issues with a huge, but I know that California critical care capacity has not been exceeded in at least Bay Area hospitals and things like that. So this is a early and noisy indicator that we might be taking a bite out of this. And hopefully these numbers, these cases will continue to go down on this graph. And so that's the case data. And those are my 3 graphs, okay? So those are my going backwards up. Always do pay attention to the differences between case data, mortality, and hospitalizations. Because what we're worried about, we're worried about mortality and hospitalizations most of all. If cases are going up, we're just uncertain what that means until we have enough people tested and enough wide application of testing that we have scratched off enough of these lottery tickets to be able to see what lies behind them.
Right.
We're making strides actually, but we're catching up from behind.
You know, there's kind of 2 things I'd like to ask you about in relation to the data. One is, actually 3 things. One is testing. It's, you know, South Korea's approach was, and I think Germany as well, kind of like test everyone, and then we'll get a better idea of what's going on. Whereas partly as a consequence of being caught a little flat-footed with how many tests were available and how effective the earliest test was in the US, would the data, I mean, it's going to show a much more accurate picture, I imagine, if we tested everybody. Why were other countries so faster to that or choosing to do that, whereas we didn't?
Yeah. Well, South Korea immediately had a meeting with the people who make the tests, and they immediately scaled up. They decided this was going to be a priority from the beginning. In the US, they actually did it, I believe, in South Korea. They did it, they ramped up the testing before they had proof of community transmission. Remember that we had a lot of things out there. South Korea was really on the ball because they had previous experience with SARS. Technically, this is a SARS virus as well, but the original SARS, that was a problem in 2002, 2003. They were ready to start testing. Now that the virus is out and we know we have these little sparks flaming up all over the country, we don't have the option of doing the contact tracing like South Korea did. And so it's kind of the hindsight. Again, we can be faster in the future. We just can't really do the contact tracing now because it would be impossible to trace all the contacts. There's so many contacts.
Right.
Testing has a different function for us now. It allows us to see the scope of the epidemic and also the scope of the asymptomatic people who never develop symptoms and yet test positive for the virus. I think there's a very important little data point. In the Life Care Center, that was a huge tragic outbreak in Kirkland, Washington. Well, 3 of them never even developed symptoms. That means that under that most susceptible age group, you have 10% of the infections they never would have known if they did not test them at that time. In other age groups, I expect that number to be higher. And that's actually, in my mind, it's bad news, good news. It's bad news because it means the disease can be transmitted very easily. But it's good news because it means these people fought it off. And I think in lower age brackets, more people are going to be able to fight it off and be asymptomatic carriers. The only question is how many. And that's why we need different kinds of tests to see if people have had it. You can't test for viral RNA if you've already kicked it out of your body. So there you have to have a different kind of test, which is a serological test or antibody test. And of course, as you know, I work on antibodies, so I'm very hoping that those tests come. I'm going to be first in line to try to get one of those tests after all the more reasonable people have been done. I think it's a great application of how antibodies can help us.
Yeah. So along those lines, early on, it looked like people 9 and under age were really not being affected very much. I've had a challenging time finding a lot of data on that. Have you seen more data, and is it continuing to play out that that's an age bracket that's really not affected nearly as much, or has that kind of joined the rest of the age groups?
Yeah. No, it's completely, it's as proven as anything else about this epidemic, honestly. There are patients, we have so many people who have died from this now that we are seeing some deaths in the lower age range. And by the way, it's important to say that we do see deaths in 1-year-olds, okay? But above 1-year-olds, something about this, there's something about young age that is protective against the progression of the disease to mortality. It's very important to point out that these people get sick. They come very close to death in some cases, but they do not end up as, they do not die from the disease. They pull through because they are on one side of a tipping point.
Right.
So that actually gives me a reason for hope. There are all sorts of things, you know, it's sort of disturbing to see the people who take the attitude of, well, I'm going to be okay, I'm not going to die. Well, you can get very sick, and number two, someone else can die because of you.
Right,
You don't want to be, you don't want to wonder, you know? So it's very important to look at that. But as a parent, I'm justified in not being worried for my children, for this at least appears to be better for them.
Right.
Not for everyone.
Right.
But I would say on the list of things to worry about your parents, you know? You don't have to worry about your kids as long as you take the normal precautions. For their sake, you don't have to be worried about them as much.
Right. Let's, you know, kind of moving into that, let's talk about how has this affected your family? I mean, so you're in Seattle, you've been dealing with this for a couple months now. And so obviously as a university professor, this has affected your job, as all of us are kind of moving to an online realm. But also, you know, what about your daily life and your family and your kids and schooling and all that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, we actually are a homeschooling family. There's actually a lot of people who homeschool in Seattle, and we have a homeschooling co-op. It's not really homeschooling because you're still doing all this stuff. You're still having classes at the homeschool co-op and things like that.
Okay.
So those classes aren't happening anymore. It actually has affected our life more than I would have expected, because it's not just like we're doing the regular stuff. All of the extra social stuff that you do, we're big in Seattle Children's Chorus. That's all canceled, you know?
Yep.
And it's realizing that those things are really important, you know, like the arts things, the getting together, the gatherings, those are really important, and really starting to miss that. You know, it's having that effect. And so it is interesting. We definitely are not immune from cabin fever, okay? Even though we can get out, we can walk, you know, but not being able to do these things, it's hard even for people who are used to homeschooling.
Right.
Then, of course, you've got, I'm supposed to keep my classes going, you know, I'm supposed to figure out how to do my classes for spring quarter online once we come back. And I'm still figuring out all that stuff right now. It's a lot of work. And I think one of the things that shouldn't have surprised me about it, but it does surprise me, just thinking about this stuff is work. Putting together this graph that I'm showing you right here, that's work, you know? And I've got to remember to allow for myself, why am I tired at the end of the day? I haven't accomplished anything of the stuff that I've wanted to. I still have to work on my syllabus for physical chemistry that's supposed to be up by Friday, right? But the thing is, it's all work and it's all important as well. Being able to process this, being able to process the uncertainty. And so one of the things that I'm trying to process is you hear a lot of voices. And some of those voices
Mhm.
are like the models that I show you. They're pessimistic or they're optimistic. And
Right.
we honestly don't know. And the important thing is not to be too happy or carefree about the optimistic voices, but also not to be too anxious about the pessimistic voices. We have such a
Right.
flood of these voices, and it's sort of just like with all the data, you shouldn't base all your data on one day's data point, whether it's going up or down. You need to take the long view when it comes to the data that I show you on the graphs, but also the data that you collect from Twitter, from following people, from Facebook, and whatever. And you're going to have people that are all over the place. The only way, in some sense, to sort of average out the data, but it's really important for me to remember that even these graphs are still uncertain, full or to glass half empty, and to just give yourself margin for expecting to be tired at the end of the day and having a different level for what it means to say, oh, I've actually accomplished, something today. If
Yeah.
you're still, if you're taking care of the people around you who need help, who are sick, if you're tending to your kids, if you're a parent, if you're tending to your parents, if you're a kid, it's really important to say that this whole thing has changed what work looks like,
Yeah.
and to give yourself room to say, okay, I did a good job today, even
Yeah.
though by standards of my productivity, my syllabus isn't ready yet. I think it's important to look at things that way. Even by homeschool standards, we didn't get what we had done today. Okay, we'll try to do better tomorrow, but this is
Yep.
just one day's data point. I think it's
Yeah.
the whole living with uncertainty. And I just wanted to make sure. I see a lot of anxious people out there.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a button on social media that would be like, um, have you looked at other data points? And you can't say that on social media because it makes them more anxious and makes you sound
Right.
like a jerk, right?
Yeah.
But the whole thing, the only person you can really do that for is yourself, or those people that you live, where you can say, just make sure that you're saying to yourself, okay, let's not fixate on any one data point, good or bad, and let's step back and take life as a whole and try to average out the data over a longer time frame. That's my metaphor, because I'm a scientist who likes to average out data.
Yeah.
So whatever works for you, finding a way to step back is, I think, a really important thing that we're all learning in this time.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I was just reading something yesterday that was talking about we're all going to feel naturally more tired just because there's a stress element to what is going on
Mm-hmm.
that we don't really acknowledge, and we don't fully understand that our body is just responding in a way that you're like, you might want to take a nap, and you don't usually take naps, but
Yeah.
we have to kind of allow that to be part of what's going on, and that's okay. And like you said, with productivity, everybody's figuring out if my kids are normally in a classroom for 6 hours a day, what does that look like for me trying to do it? Because I am not a good teacher of 10-year-olds. And
Mm.
so, how do I establish that balance and everything? So, um, okay, can you unshare the screen real quick? I just kind of want to make sure,
Yeah.
just in case people haven't been seeing us during this
Oh
part of
yeah.
the
Here I
conversation,
am. Yeah.
just want to make sure that they see you one more time. Um, Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Ben. This was really, really interesting and I think really important. And I just want to say I'm grateful to you for really being interested in diving into this and helping us to understand this better as far as how we look at the numbers.
Yeah. And well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to more people about data. It's kind of like what I'm built for. And I think it's really important for all of us. I mean, we're in a data-driven age, right? And you're talking about how to deal with one kind of data. I guess the last thing that occurs to me, in all of our classes that we teach, we're talking about dealing with a different kind of data in a different way. And there are some lessons that you can take from that class, even if it's just in molecular genetics, and you can
Mhm.
apply it to data that you get for Snohomish County hospitalizations. As
Okay.
long as you're careful not to lean too much on that, and as long as you're listening for if you do it wrong, listening for someone to correct you who actually knows more about that data. Just be uncertain about what you know.
Right.
But I think data can actually be comforting because it's a number. So yeah, it's I really have come to appreciate what our students are going through, you know, whether they're going into the health field, however they're using data ultimately. I think it's really kind of a privilege to be able to teach how to look at data, you know, and to be able to use that in your life.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate it. My best to you as you get ready to go back to classes, and I wish you and your family the best in staying healthy through all this.